Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel as I take a look at another McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse figure release. And it's been a while since my last action figure review from this line, but today I'm going to be looking at the special edition gold label release of Bane from The Dark Knight Rises. And I think this release is a perfect example of a recent and slightly frustrating trend with McFarlane Toys, where they seem to increasingly alienate and upset their existing and long-term collectors with an often frustrating and quite limited numbers for real big hitters such as the 1989 Batmobile set or the more recent Amazon exclusive Batman set, which had all the different film iterations of Batman across the years, being very limited in scope, very limited in number, and very difficult to get hold of. This is immensely frustrating, especially for long-time collectors who've really wanted these figures and have been subsequently denied getting access to them. And here, once again, we have another example of a figure that's gonna kind of upset those fans who went deep and supported the Dark Knight trilogy line by getting all four of the figures in that wave to build the Build-A-Figure, which was Bane. And here he is being re-released, but this time with the added bonus of this fancy trench coat, which does complete the look somewhat. And so you're going to feel a little bit cheated having to fork out and buy this version of the character again to get that extra accessory. That's not going to go down well with a lot of fans. However, it did work for me because I wasn't able to pick up the Dark Knight trilogy wave. So, without further ado, let's kick off by taking a look at the packaging. Now, by now, if you've watched any of my other videos looking at the DC Multiverse line from McFarlane Toys, you'll know exactly my thoughts on this packaging. But if you're new here, let me give you my feelings on this packaging. I essentially find it quite dull and a little bit of a wasted opportunity. Now, up front and centre, we have this window display, which is great. We can see the figure in all of its glory. We do have the gold label there, which is quite eye-catching, which is quite nice. And then behind the figure, we have this nice blue and white collage taken from the comic book pages and various source material from across DC's history, which is quite nicely done, to be fair. My issues with this packaging really comes from the rest of it. Really, we have these big, thick black borders. In this case, we do have the Dark Knight trilogy logo, which is quite nice. But otherwise, it's quite bland and there's not really an awful lot going on here. This is particularly egregious when we look at the side panel, which is a huge, thick panel, which, you know, doesn't have an awful lot going on. It just has the name of the character and, again, the Dark Knight trilogy logo there. And this could have been so much better utilised if they just had an image from the film or the source material or even just a photo of the figure itself. It would have just looked a lot more attractive if you're putting these figures on display on your shelf. It would have made them a lot more colourful and fun to look at. But if we look at the back of the packaging, this is where it really comes into its own, and this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, having this fantastic image here taken from the film. This looks glorious. I really like this. It is largely text-free as well, so you're getting the image completely unspoiled, and this looks really eye-catching and dramatic, and this looks great. I just wish they'd do this on the side panel and maybe something a little bit more colourful on the front of the packaging as well. Okay, so opening the figure up, I think the first thing to mention here is that this is, yep, unsurprisingly, the same figure as the Build-A-Figure. There's very little differences, but we will look at those a little bit later. So if we start off by taking a look at this head sculpt, I think this is a pretty decent sculpt. I think they've done a good job. Now, it's hard really to go wrong here because obviously we're dealing with a pretty much a masked character. But I think in terms of the detail, this looks pretty much spot on. I think they've done a pretty good job. There's enough detail in the sculpt itself. There's some decent paint apps here as well to draw out some of those details, and I think, you know, what we can see of the eyes and the expression there, I think this looks like Tom Hardy. I think they've caught this element pretty well, to be fair. Sadly, the torso and the legs, and I suppose the arms of this figure are less impressive. The torso has a very odd sort of rubber casing, which definitely lacks a little bit of detail. Now, the sculpt itself is fine, but when it comes to the paint apps, there's not an awful lot going on here. They're quite muted and quite flat colours. The chest, in particular, looks very plastic-like, and it just doesn't look very authentic, I suppose, which is a little bit distracting. Likewise, the legs, the sculpt is fine, but there's just not a lot of detailing when it comes to paint apps, and that's definitely a weakness here. If we look at the hands though, we can see some decent sculpting here and actually some nice paint apps, particularly on the right fist, where we can actually see there's a bit of a wash running over the leather straps here, which does give that impression of texture and depth, which is quite nicely done. So I think this actually looks pretty good, and the hands, interestingly, are one of the things that separate this out from the Build-A-Figure. The Build-A-Figure had open hands. This figure obviously has two closed fists. Now, sadly, no alternate hands come with this figure at all. It would have been nice to have the choice, but I suppose this is one of the reasons to double dip. Now, of course, probably the main reason you've come to this video is to talk about the coat, and I have to say this is the star of the show. I really love how they've approached this. This is a leather or a faux leather coat. It has a faux fur inline as well, and they've done a really nice job of this. Mixing and matching real cloth materials against the hard plastic works really well, and this is very nicely tailored, very nicely sewn together. The proportions are just right, and yeah, I have to say this elevates the whole figure. This makes this figure look about 10 times better than it does without the coat, and I'm actually very impressed with it. And in case you're wondering what the figure looks like with and without the coat, here they are side by side. So this is the same figure, just having the coat removed, and as you can see, it's so much more elevated. This just looks a lot stronger with the coat than without. If you want to see how this compares against the Build-A-Figure version, as you can see, it's pretty much the same figure. There might be some minor colour variations on the torso there, and of course the hands are different, but otherwise this is pretty much exactly the same figure. So let's take a look at the articulation without the coat so you can get a much better sense of how it all works. It does have a ball joint to the top of the head, so he can move his head from side to side, lean it left and right a little bit, it's more of a wobble, and he can look up and down a healthy distance too, which is nice to see. Now, he does have a ball joint in the shoulder, and you'll notice there's also a butterfly wing joint there as well, which will allow the arm to lean forwards and backwards, which is great, but the arm can't really lift out that much at all, which is a bit disappointing, to be honest. You'd think it'd have a much greater range of motion than it actually does. Then if we see it has a complementary bicep swivel, which is pretty useful, and it does have this double joint at the elbow. Now it looks a little bit strange when you do it like this, but it is great to have that articulation, and when you have the coat on you can't see this, so it looks pretty cool. Now he does have this rather strange joint at the wrist. It's a bit ugly looking and the paint is a little bit inconsistent, but it does allow the wrist to rotate all the way around and hinge forwards and backwards, although yeah, it does look very odd. Then there is this rather strange torso, and there is a ball joint in the top of the waist there, allowing the figure to move from side to side, lean left and right, and bend forwards and backwards a pretty healthy distance too. So actually this works pretty well. Now there's a hinge at the hips allowing the legs to kick out to the side, the legs can also kick forwards and kick backwards a little bit, and there's another double joint this time at the knee allowing that lower leg to kick all the way back there. Finally, there is an ankle pivot at the top of the ankle there, allowing the foot to hinge forwards and backwards and arc left and right a little bit, as well as some toe articulation. And, well, that's your lot. You don't even get a trading card or a stand with this figure, so there's no accessories whatsoever, which, again, I think is maybe a little bit of a misstep on the part of McFarlane Toys. If you're trying to encourage people to double dip, then you need some more incentives, I think, to really encourage them. It's great having an alternate pair of hands here, but, you know, maybe there's other things they could have done or thrown in with this figure just to make it a little bit more exciting, a bit more enticing. All that being said, the trench coat is absolutely awesome. This is definitely the best version of this figure in my opinion, so if you don't mind double dipping, then this is definitely the superior version and is probably worth it, and you might be able to sell your Build-A-Figure. The Build-A-Figure itself, or the figure without the trench coat, definitely has some issues. I think the proportions are slightly off. He just doesn't look quite big enough or chunky enough, particularly in the arm area. It just looks a little bit too skinny there for what we see in the film. Tom Hardy's obviously much thicker, much more built than we see with this figure proportionally. So this looks a little bit off, but with the trench coat this looks absolutely fantastic, and you know, I think probably all things being equal, and treating this release as a standalone and not thinking about the previously released Build-A-Figure, then this is a decent figure, and I think the trench coat is really cool and hides a multitude of sins, but you know, if we're taking that trench coat off, then yeah, there's definitely issues when it comes to the paint apps and the sculpting here, which drag it down a little bit. So for me, simple 3 stars, but a pretty decent figure. If you can pick this up cheaply, or you know, you haven't already got the Build-A-Figure but you like the character, then this is definitely worth adding to your collection, and this is probably the superior version of the two. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.